We all know the Spanish Inquisition. Dark rooms and iron spikes and dungeons and hooded figures and torture chambers and all that kind of stuff. It is one of the most enduring images in Western culture. But there's a big problem with this. It's that almost everything we think we know about the Spanish Inquisition is wrong. Now, not slightly wrong, not Hollywood took a few liberties kind of wrong, completely wrong. The Spanish Inquisition we carry around in our heads is a complete cultural invention. So today what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm afraid, take apart one of these myths. And we're going to talk about what the Spanish Inquisition actually was and how Europe invented a version of that that was far more dramatic, far more sinister, and far more useful than the truth ever was. Now, to understand the myth, you need to understand the Europe that basically created it. The Spanish Inquisition was founded in 1478, but the myth of the Spanish Inquisition, the version we know, was created much, much later, and created by people who basically hated Spain. And this, of course, is the era of the Protestant Reformation, where religious propaganda, political rivalry, imperial competition, and, this is a Europe essentially that needs villains, really. And Spain, of course, is ripe for that, because Spain is the great superpower of the 16th century. It has the largest empire. It has, certainly for a while, the strongest navy. It has all that gold pouring in from the Americas and so on. It's Catholic, it's wealthy, militarily dominant, and really feared politically and economically. And Protestant Europe essentially needed a way to explain why Catholic Spain was so powerful and why Protestant Northern Europeans weren't. So Protestant Europe invents a story, the Black Legend, which portrays Spain as uniquely cruel, uniquely fanatical, and uniquely tyrannical. And the Inquisition becomes the perfect symbol of all of that. It's a dark, terrifying institution. So you have all these pamphlets and things circulating across Europe describing torture chambers and mass burnings and secret prisons and inquisitors who delighted in cruelty, sort of cackling villains in cowls and so on. Entirely fictional. They're all just made up. But of course they stick and they're believed because they're useful. And they allow these Protestant nations now to define themselves as enlightened, as rational, as morally superior. So that's what they did. That's what we're fighting, as it were, against. And that's what we're progressing forward away from all this stuff. So the myth of the Spanish Inquisition became a kind of political weapon. It's a way for Europe to explain its own divisions and justify its own ambitions. So what about the real Inquisition, the one that actually existed? Well, it was essentially a bureaucratic legal machine. It was kind of tedious at times. It was lots of paperwork. And it dealt with a lot of doctrinal kind of nitpicking, minor moral offences, and the everyday squabbles of a religious society. It was not a torture factory. It was not a shadowy cabal of hooded fanatics. And when we talk about this torture, by the way, torture was used far less than people think, and always under strict legal limits. In fact, secular courts in Europe used torture far more frequently and far more brutally than the Inquisition ever did. The Inquisition's procedures, by contrast to that, they were regulated, they were documented, and they were subject to some kind of oversight. Now, it wasn't humane, but it also wasn't the sadistic kind of free-for-all of legend. When it comes to things like executions, over its entire history, the Spanish Inquisition executed far fewer people than the myth suggests. The numbers of this are still very much debated, but they're nowhere near the sort of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands claimed in the popular imagination. Most people who appeared before the Inquisition weren't executed. They were fined or reprimanded or ordered to perform penance or often released. So the Inquisition was many things, but it was not the industrial killing machine of legend. Now, to understand the Inquisition, you have to understand Spain in the late 15th century. This is a newly unified kingdom, remember. This is a political marriage between Castile and Aragon, which is trying to forge a single identity out of a very diverse population. And of course, Spain itself is a melting pot. It has Christians and Jews and Muslims and converts and people who lived in the kind of grey zones between all these different categories. And what the monarchy wants to do is it wants religious unity, essentially, because it believes that unity equals stability. And the Inquisition is essentially created to police conversion. Specifically the so-called conversos. These are Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure, and many of them are accused of essentially practicing Judaism in secret. And the monarchy feared really that divided religious loyalties would undermine this fragile new political unity that they've created. So the Inquisition isn't created to hunt heretics, which is often the way it's painted. It's there to enforce this political unity. It's a tool essentially of state building. It's a way for the monarchy to centralize authority, to control religious life and assert its dominance now over local institutions. And so it's not a medieval relic, if you like. In fact, it's a very modern institution of a modernizing state. And I think this is the part that often surprises people. The Inquisition was far more regulated and more legally structured than many secular courts. So it was authoritarian, but it wasn't anarchic. It's a system designed to produce order, not terror. Now, the myth of the Spanish Inquisition did not emerge naturally. It's constructed, as many of these myths we've talked about are, deliberately and strategically and with great enthusiasm. When people have their hand on a myth that's going to help them in the present, then they're happy to distort the past, as we've seen with many examples. So Protestant writers of the 16th and 17th centuries produced these lurid accounts of the torture chambers and the secret trials and the mass executions and so on. Now, many of these people had never even been to Spain. Some relied on travellers' tales and rumours and whispers. Others just simply invented all these details. And these stories were printed, translated and circulated widely. They become part of Europe's political vocabulary. And of course, the Enlightenment then takes that over and turns these stories and amplifies them now, makes them bigger and exaggerates them, as the Enlightenment does, as we said before, about everything really in the medieval pre-modern world. They make it sound as bad as possible so that their project looks fantastic and revolutionary and progressive. So you look at Voltaire and Diderot and all these philosophers and so on. They use the Inquisition as a symbol of Catholic tyranny, religious fanaticism. It's a convenient villain now in this whole story of progress. It's a kind of reminder, you see, of the darkness from which Europe had supposedly emerged with the Enlightenment. And by the 19th century, the Inquisition had become just a cultural icon. Painters depicted these dramatic scenes of torture and execution. Novelists write melodramatic tales of these innocent victims and cruel inquisitors and so on. And historians just repeat these exaggerated claims without checking any of the sources. So the Spanish Inquisition becomes a symbol of everything Europe wanted to condemn: religious intolerance, political tyranny, and the dangers of absolute power. Now, there's another reason why the myth of the Spanish Inquisition spread so effectively, and one that has nothing to do with Spain at all, and everything to do with technology. The Spanish Inquisition emerged at almost the exact moment that Europe discovered printing. And printing, of course, was not neutral. It had, geography, economics, and ideology all baked into it. The printing revolution itself was overwhelmingly a Northern European phenomenon. So Germany, the Low Countries, Switzerland, later England, these become centres of mass printing. And these, of course, are the regions that embrace Protestantism. Printing didn't just spread ideas, it spread images. And images, of course, are far more powerful than text. Northern European printers produced thousands upon thousands of woodcuts depicting the Spanish Inquisition as a theatre of cruelty, with the victims stretched out on racks and prisoners suspended in chains. We all know the images. Inquisitors kind of looming in shadow, like, you know, Darth Sidious or something. Flames rising from the stakes and crowds watching on, all of this stuff. These images aren't accurate at all. They're pure propaganda. They're designed to terrify, to outrage, and to define Spain, and therefore the Catholic world generally, as the enemy of civilization. And crucially, of course, they're aimed also at the unlettered. Because you don't need to learn to read. You don't need to read Latin or theology or whatever to understand a woodcut of a man being tortured. You don't need to follow kind of doctrinal debates and so on to recognize cruelty. A single image can do the work of 1,000 sermons. And printing allows Protestant Europe to mass produce fear. And because these images are cheap and portable, easy to reproduce, they spread across borders faster than any official, you know, Spanish government response could emerge to counter them. So the myth of the Spanish Inquisition survives because it was printed. And as we all know today, of course, printed myths, images, are very, very hard to kill. Now, of course, this all isn't about defending the Inquisition. I hope you get that by now. It does do unpleasant things. It does enforce conformity. It punishes dissent, absolutely, and they're things we can condemn. And it serves a monarchy that essentially wanted control. But the myth matters because what it does is it shows how history is shaped. History is shaped, remember, not by what happened. It's shaped by what people wanted to believe. And we'll see that in the coming weeks with many, many of these myths that we're going to challenge. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all, my friends, next time. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.